In 2020, a house could be purchased for $300,000, but today, that same property costs $450,000, an increase not driven by genuine value but by inflation. This isn't happenstance, it's by design. Between 2020 and 2022, the Federal Reserve pumped into the economy a staggering $4.5 trillion, a vast sum that didn't flow into your pockets. Instead, it went directly to banks, enabling them to acquire assets. Meanwhile, you're 30% poorer, and those who own assets have become 30% wealthier. Let me clarify how this theft unfolded. There's a covert mechanism that has been siphoning your purchasing power over the past 4 years. Nothing like taxes, which are visible on your paycheck, or fees, which are transparent. Instead, it's a hidden process that transferred 30% of your economic strength to individuals who already possess wealth. Most people are unaware because this operation has been cloaked in technical jargon. Terms like quantitative easing, monetary policy, and liquidity injection, all sophisticated words for the manipulation of money that results in wealth transfer. Here's what occurred in March 2020. The economy shut down due to COVID. Businesses closed, and consumer spending ground to a halt. The stock market plummeted 35% within a month. The Federal Reserve faced a choice: allow markets to correct naturally by letting over-leveraged companies fail and asset prices fall to realistic levels, or again, do what they've repeatedly done since 2008, print money en masse. They chose the latter. On March 15, 2020, the Fed unveiled emergency measures. Interest rates were cut to zero, and they announced unlimited quantitative easing, an unprecedented move. This meant they would purchase as many treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities as necessary to stabilize markets. But what does that mean in practice? Quantitative easing involves the Federal Reserve electronically creating new money, digital entries, not physical bills, and using it to buy government bonds and securities from banks. Essentially, the Fed is generating dollars out of thin air, crediting bank accounts, while banks exchange these bonds for new money. This process floods the financial system with liquidity, giving banks the means to lend or invest freely. As a result, the Fed's balance sheet swells with the assets it acquires. Before the 2808 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's holdings totaled around $800 billion. After multiple rounds of easing since that crisis, by 2020, it had grown to $4 trillion. Then, within just 2 years, from March of 2020 to March of 2022, the Fed expanded its assets further by another $4.5 trillion. This means their balance sheet ballooned from $4 trillion to nearly $9 trillion, a massive injection of freshly created money in 2 years, surpassing the total amount printed over the entire previous century. It's crucial to understand. This $4.5 trillion didn't arrive as checks in your mailbox or deposits in your bank account. It primarily flowed into banks and financial institutions. They received this capital, and what did they do with it? Following the Federal Reserve's creation of fresh money, banks accumulated substantial cash reserves. Rather than extending credit broadly to individuals and small businesses, an endeavor fraught with risk during the economic uncertainties of 2020 and 2021, they capitalized by investing directly into assets. They purchased stocks, corporate bonds, and mortgage-backed securities. Meanwhile, affluent clients leveraged their existing portfolios, borrowing near-zero interest rates to acquire even more assets. For example, a wealthy investor with $10 million in stocks could secure a $3 to $5 million loan, backed by those holdings, at interest rates close to 1%. This process amplified asset prices, enriching those already invested while leaving typical savers and workers further behind. Using borrowed funds, the wealthy buy appreciating assets like real estate or stocks, profiting as their value rises, all while interest rates remain near zero. With nearly no borrowing costs, just a small fraction of a percentage, they leverage other people's money to amplify gains. This strategy only succeeds when low interest rates coincide with rising asset prices, conditions the Federal Reserve's money printing has simultaneously fostered. In stark contrast, most workers lack such leverage. Their savings, often just a few tens of thousands, are insufficient to secure low-interest loans. Instead, they face credit card rates soaring to 18% or personal loans at 8 to 12. Access to cheap credit is out of reach, and without enough capital, leverage remains an unattainable tool. The system is designed to enable the wealthy to borrow cheaply and capitalize on appreciating assets, while everyday people pay high interest and watch asset values soar beyond their grasp. From 2020 to 2022, this disparity widened dramatically. The top 10% of Americans increased their wealth by approximately $13 trillion, whereas the bottom 50%, around 165 million people, increased their wealth by roughly $2 trillion. Despite being just a fifth of the population, the wealthy captured 6 times the wealth gains of the lower half, solely because they owned assets that appreciated during the Fed's inflationary surge. If you owned stocks in March 2020, you benefited handsomely. The S&P 500 more than doubled from 2,300 to nearly 4,800 by late 2021. $1 million in stocks became over $2 million, a profit of $1 million earned sitting idly. Conversely, those living paycheck to paycheck or just starting out saw none of these gains. Meanwhile, the inflation driven by the Fed's money printing caused the cost of rent, groceries, and gasoline to escalate, squeezing their budgets even further. This systematic transfer of wealth from the many to the few is the core of the theft. The Federal Reserve injects money that floods the asset markets, inflating prices, while the average person bears the rising living costs without participating in gains. Legally sanctioned and openly acknowledged, they aim to boost asset values to generate what they call a wealth effect. This policy only benefits asset owners. Understanding what inflation truly entails is crucial. Officially, the government measures it through the Consumer Price Index, yet the reality experienced by most people, rising costs of essentials, far exceeds the official numbers. The Consumer Price Index, or CPI, tracks a curated basket of everyday goods and services: food, energy, housing, transportation, and healthcare. Between 2020 and 2023, the official CPI inflation figure registered about 18%, a number reported by the government. Over these 3 years, prices, on average, increased by this amount. But this figure masks the reality faced by most people. Housing, which accounts for the largest expenditure for many Americans, grew far more than the 18%. Depending on the market, media and home prices surged between 35 to 40%. Rent costs rose in most cities by 25 to 30%. Food prices increased even more. Eggs alone jumped over 70%, while staples like chicken, beef, bread, and milk rose between 25 and 50%, varying by region and item. Used cars skyrocketed by 40% in 21 before easing slightly, and gasoline more than doubled from the lows of 2020 to the highs of 22. Healthcare costs continued their steady climb, and childcare expenses surged at the same time. The essentials in daily life, groceries, fuel, healthcare, went up far more than the official 18%. Yet, the CPI includes items like electronics, which have become cheaper, and statistical methods that tend to understate actual inflation. Consequently, while the government reports the inflation at 18%, many Americans' lived experience indicates 30 to 40%, and their experience is accurate. This discrepancy matters because it reveals a hidden truth. If official inflation is 18%, but your costs increase by 35%, the government is essentially misleading you. They claim inflation is manageable, downplaying the hardship you face in affording groceries and everyday necessities. Economists and politicians often say inflation is temporary or easing, but prices rarely decrease en masse. Instead, the rate of increase slows, yet high prices remain permanently. If your rent jumps from $1,500 to $2,000, a 33% rise, that cost isn't going back down. It stays elevated, permanently diminishing your purchasing power. This persistent increase acts as an invisible tax. Unlike income tax, which is overt and directly visible on your paycheck, or sales tax, clear on receipts, inflation sneaks in silently. It erodes the value of your money each time you buy something, often without notice until you compare prices over time. The Federal Reserve caused this inflation, printing an astonishing $4.5 trillion, and they knew exactly what would happen. They understood that boosting the money supply by 50% within 2 years would devalue the currency and lead to price increases. Yet, they proceeded, prioritizing the protection of financial markets and existing asset holdings over your ability to buy. Back in March of 2020, Fed Chair Jerome Powell publicly declared that the Federal Reserve would do whatever it takes to support the economy: zero interest rates, unlimited quantitative easing. The rationale was that the economy was collapsing, businesses shutting down, unemployment skyrocketing to 14%. Without intervention, they warned, a depression was inevitable. But one fundamental question was left unasked. Why did the money flow primarily into banks and asset markets instead of directly to the people? While stimulus checks, totaling around $1,200 per individual in April of 2020, provided some relief, they were nowhere near enough to compensate for the inflation's impact. The bulk of the newly created money, over $4 trillion, went into the coffers of banks and financial institutions, fueling asset bubbles and enriching the already wealthy. In December 2020, the government issued $600 in stimulus aid per person, followed by $1,400 in March 2021, totaling around $3,200 annually. While helpful, this barely cushioned the blow of 30% inflation. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve funneled a staggering $4.5 trillion into financial institutions. Had that immense sum been divided among 330 million Americans, each person would have received over $13,000. For a family of four, that would amount to $54,000. Imagine if instead of inflating asset markets through bank bailouts, the Fed had directly given every American family $50,000. Home prices might still have risen because people would have used that money for down payments. But at least, ordinary people would have shared in the benefits of rising asset values rather than being pushed out of the market altogether. However, the system is deliberately structured to channel money primarily through banks and financial giants. They receive the funds first, purchasing assets before prices escalate. By the time the benefits trickle down to wage earners or job seekers, markets have already adjusted and prices are inflated. This phenomenon is known as the Kantian effect, named after an 18th-century economist who observed that those closest to the source of new money enjoy the greatest benefit, spending it before inflation takes hold. Those further away, ordinary workers and savers, are left holding inflated assets or facing higher costs without having benefited from the original influx. In modern times, banks and large financial institutions are closest to the Federal Reserve's digital liquidity injections. They receive trillions in freshly created money and swiftly deploy it into markets, sending asset prices soaring. When this capital finally percolates down to workers in wages or employment, prices have already risen, meaning their paycheck increases of 3 or 5% are dwarfed by a 30% surge in living costs. As a result, workers are net losers. This dynamic illustrates why money printing consistently enriches the wealthy while impoverishing middle and lower-income populations. It's not an inadvertent flaw, but an intrinsic feature of the monetary system's design. Now, who actually controls the Federal Reserve, and why is it set up this way? The Fed operates independently of the federal government, not as a direct agency like the Treasury or the IRS. Instead, it's a hybrid entity, partly private. There are 12 regional Federal Reserve banks across the country, owned by private member banks such as J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Citigroup, and Wells Fargo, all of whom are shareholders in the system. While the Board of Governors, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, sets broad policy and oversight, these regional banks function as private entities. This structure creates a dual allegiance. The Fed is ostensibly tasked with serving the public, aiming for maximum employment and stable prices, yet it remains deeply entangled with big banking interests. Many Fed officials come from Wall Street and often return there after their terms, reinforcing a system in which regulatory and monetary decisions are heavily influenced, if not primarily driven, by the banking industry's priorities. Jerome Powell, the sitting chair of the Federal Reserve, previously held a position in private equity and before that, worked at the Treasury Department and an investment bank. Janet Yellen, the former Fed chair who is now the Secretary of the Treasury, spent decades as a university professor and held various roles within the Federal. During the 2008 financial crisis, Ben Bernanke led the Fed. He transitioned from academia to become an advisor for a hedge fund afterward. This revolving door between regulators and industry is relentless. Officials who oversee banks often find themselves hired by those same institutions once their tenure ends. This creates a deep-rooted conflict of interest. If you're a Fed official expecting a lucrative future role at giants like JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs, are you truly going to impose strict regulations? Or will you favor leniency and support? The latter is far more common. Consequently, the Fed has effectively become captured by the very industry it's supposed to oversee. This dynamic explains why in every crisis, the immediate response of the Fed is to safeguard banks and asset markets, not ordinary citizens. During the 2008 crisis, trillions of dollars were directed to bail out banks. In COVID's aftermath, the pattern repeated itself. When panic strikes, the Fed prints vast amounts of money, so much so that since 2008, it has cumulatively created over $10 trillion and funnel it predominantly into financial institutions. Meanwhile, ordinary Americans receive only crumbs, small stimulus checks, or limited unemployment benefits, while wealth continues to flow upward, concentrating at the top. Over the past 14 years, with the Fed's massive money printing, the wealth gap in America has widened to its broadest since the 1920s, highlighting a stark reality. The Fed's policies are the primary engine fueling modern wealth inequality. For those in their 20s or 30s today, this has meant a deep financial squeeze, policies crafted behind closed doors and implemented without your say. Imagine you graduated college in 2015, burdened with $40,000 in student debt, earning $50,000 annually. Your monthly expenses include $1,200 for rent and $400 for student loans, leaving you with perhaps $500 in savings each month if you're careful. By 2020, you've amassed about $30,000 in savings, dreaming of buying a home in a market where prices hover around $300,000. You'd need $60,000 for a 20% down payment, which would mean 2 more years of disciplined saving. Then COVID hits. The Fed floods the market with money, and housing prices surge. By 2022, that same house now costs nearly $420,000. Now, you'd need $84,000 for a down payment, more than you had saved. In these 2 years, you managed to save another $12,000, bringing your total to $42,000. But the target has risen to $84,000. You're now further from your goal than in 2020. Meanwhile, your rent skyrocketed from $1,200 to $1,800 a month, an additional $600 each month, or $7,200 annually, cutting your savings rate in half as rent consumes your surplus. Your groceries increased from $300 to $500 a month, costing you an extra $2,400 annually, and gas doubled from $30 to $50 to fill up. Your income, meanwhile, only rose modestly, perhaps $5,500 more per year after taxes, a mere 10% increase. But your expenses skyrocketed: rent, groceries, gas, all up significantly, while your pay stagnated. You're being pushed backward, not forward, as the cost of living outpaces your earning capacity, and the property you aim to buy becomes increasingly out of reach. This is the consequence of the Federal Reserve inflating asset prices far beyond your means, while your wages remain stagnant and your costs escalate. In contrast, those who owned assets before the flood of money reaped enormous benefits. If you owned a house worth $300,000 with a small mortgage at 3% interest, its value would have soared to more than $420,000. If you held stocks worth $1 million, they doubled to over $2 million, all without lifting a finger, just by knowing how to own assets when the Fed prints money. In just 2 years, they quietly became hundreds of thousands, or even millions, richer, while you fall increasingly behind. This is the true theft, a transfer of wealth from working Americans to asset owners, intensified by each round of money printing. Since 1980, wages, after adjusting for official inflation, have risen only about 20%, while asset values, stocks and real estate, have increased more than 500%. If your income stagnates, your wealth literally slips further away while the wealthy profit exponentially from inflated asset prices. The system favors ownership, punishing labor. The choices the Fed made during crises, bailing out banks, propping up asset markets, and creating trillions, deliberately directed wealth upward. The central bank's role became one of protecting the financial elite, not safeguarding the interests of ordinary people. Since 2008, over $10 trillion of newly created money have been funneled into the banking system, resulting in the greatest wealth disparity since the age of the Roaring Twenties. That isn't coincidence, it's the intended consequence. For young workers trying to buy homes, the landscape has become impossible. The surge in home prices, combined with rising interest rates, has priced many out of ownership. Today, a typical mortgage at 7%, up from near zero, means monthly payments triple what they were just a few years ago, making homeownership unattainable for a large portion of millennials and Generation Z. Corporate landlords, having bought up thousands of houses during low-interest times, now rent them at market rates, profiting handsomely while renters see their costs soar and their prospects dim. The system is effectively trapping most in a cycle of rent and stagnating wages, with no easy way out, since the policies already in place and the tools used have exhausted their options. Reversing course now would risk reigniting inflation or plunging the economy into a sharp downturn, both of which would harm ordinary Americans most of all. The entire framework is trapped in a dilemma: either accept runaway inflation or face a deep economic collapse. The result is a rigged system where the so-called benefits of a free market are largely illusions. The majority of the gains go to those who own assets, not those who work for wages. The lessons of recent history are clear. The Federal Reserve's policies, massive money printing, asset inflation, and bank bailouts have widened the wealth divide and impoverished the American middle and lower classes. For young workers, the lesson is sobering. The policies designed to stabilize the economy have instead orchestrated the transfer of wealth to the powerful, hidden behind technical language and official reports. Understanding this process is vital because the next crisis looms, and unless you grasp how the system is rigged, you will be left vulnerable to the next wave of upheaval. If you're relying on wages alone, you're playing a losing game. Since 2020, your everyday expenses for essentials have soared by over $10,000 annually, while your income has risen only modestly, from $50,000 to perhaps $55,000. That's a mere 10% increase over 5 years, translating to about $5,500 before taxes, roughly $4,000 after. Yet, your costs have skyrocketed by $10,000, leaving you $6,000 worse off each year in real purchasing power. Meanwhile, the home you once aspired to buy now demands an additional $24,000 for a larger down payment, as prices have climbed by more than $4,000 a month. You're effectively moving backward, not because of poor decisions, but because the Federal Reserve inflated asset prices beyond your reach, all while raising your costs and stagnating your wages. Systematically, monetary policy has impoverished many. In stark contrast stands someone who owned assets in 2020, their house valued at $300,000 with a $200,000 mortgage at 3% interest. Their monthly payment remains around $1,000, and they held $200,000 in stocks. When COVID struck and the Fed unleashed its money-printing frenzy, that house's value rose to $420,000, an equity gain of $120,000. Their stocks doubled, adding another $200,000 in wealth. Over merely 2 years, they gained a total of $320,000, simply by holding assets, without working harder or smarter. Meanwhile, you are $6,000 poorer each year and further from owning a home. This, fundamentally, is theft, a transfer of wealth from wage earners to asset owners, an acceleration of inequality. Since 1980, wages, after official inflation adjustments, have grown by only about 20%, whereas asset prices, stocks, and real estate surged over 500%. If you own assets, you're gaining. If you rely solely on wages, you're basically treading water. The system actively rewards ownership while punishing labor, driven by the Federal Reserve's relentless money printing. What could the Fed have done differently? Alternatives existed. Instead of propping up markets, allowing over-leveraged firms to fail, and letting asset prices find sustainable levels would have resulted in short-term pain. Unemployment would have remained high longer, and markets would have stagnated, but within a few years, the economy would have recalibrated. Affordable housing, fairly valued stocks, a functioning system. Instead, the Fed chose to sustain the bubble, keeping asset prices inflated, supporting zombie companies, and shielding the wealthy from the consequences. The true cost is borne by those without assets, who face rising inflation, unaffordable homes, and stagnant wages that don't keep pace with costs. This approach socializes the pain while privatizing the gains. Another possible approach was to distribute the newly created money directly to citizens, rather than funneling it into banks. Yet, the systemic structure favors elites. Understanding this pattern reveals how policies have perpetuated inequality and shifted wealth upwards, favoring those who already own assets at the expense of wage earners struggling to keep afloat. Had the Federal Reserve allocated $4.5 trillion equally among all Americans, each individual would have received approximately $13,000. This surge of cash would have directly fueled day-to-day expenses, covering rent, food, and other essentials, supporting local businesses and the economy at large. Naturally, some of this money would have filtered into asset markets, elevating prices. But at least everyday people would have shared in the rise of asset values. Instead, the funds were funneled into banks, which acquired assets before their prices soared. As a result, many of you were priced out of homeownership and investments, while the banking elite grew wealthier. This was no accident. It was the deliberate design of a system whose primary goal is to safeguard the financial institutions, asset markets, and the wealthy ownership class, not the average person. There's a stark distinction. You are a participant in the economy, but not part of its protected financial system. When the Fed faces a choice, favoring the stability of banks and markets or safeguarding ordinary citizens, it consistently prioritizes the former. As a consequence, the inflationary wave of 2021 to 2023 has become entrenched and irreversible. Despite raising interest rates from 0 to 5% in 2022 and 2023 to combat inflation, the effects have remained entrenched. This tightening slowed hiring, halted wage growth, and yet, prices stayed stubbornly high. Housing values plateaued but did not decline substantially, and with interest rates now soaring, home purchases have become prohibitively expensive. Today, buying a house now costs around $420,000, with mortgage payments exceeding $3,000 monthly, a stark contrast to the $1,000 in 2019. Income increases have lagged far behind, rising roughly 15% during this period, leaving many unable to afford homeownership. For many millennials and Generation Z, the dream of owning a home has slipped out of reach. 40% of millennials will never own a house, instead remaining in the rental market. Many rent from large corporate landlords like Blackstone or Invitation Homes, which purchased tens of thousands of homes during the low-interest debt era and now profit handsomely from market-rate rents. These corporations, armed with cheap mortgages at 2 to 3%, are capitalizing on inflated housing prices, making large profits at the expense of everyday renters. The harsh reality is that the Federal Reserve cannot reverse this trend, at least not without catastrophic consequences. Lowering interest rates back to zero and flooding the system with even more money would trigger another spike in inflation, pushing prices higher still. Conversely, keeping rates elevated risks plunging the economy into recession, increasing unemployment and hardship for many. The tools have been exhausted. The system is effectively trapped. The only outcomes left are either the chaos of runaway inflation, which erodes the currency's value, or severe deflation that collapses asset markets. In either scenario, the vast majority, those without significant assets, face profound losses, while asset owners may hold the chance to weather the storm if they can endure the volatility. If you're just surviving paycheck to paycheck without any assets, you're heading for disaster. The Federal Reserve effectively siphoned off wealth through the printing of $4.5 trillion, most of which, 95%, flowed directly to banks and asset owners, while a mere 5% trickled down as stimulus checks to ordinary people. During this period, asset prices surged by 30 to 40%, and so did your living costs, your rent, groceries, and everyday expenses. Meanwhile, your wages only increased by a modest 5 to 10%, leaving you 30% poorer in real terms. In contrast, those already wealthy became 30% richer, widening the stark divide. Homeownership, once achievable, slipped beyond reach for many as the wealth gap exploded. Your future, your financial stability, was essentially stolen by unelected officials at the Federal Reserve, whose priority was safeguarding banks and asset markets rather than your purchasing power. This isn't a conspiracy theory. It's clear, documented policy. The Fed explicitly targets rising asset prices. Its balance sheet openly displays the $4.5 trillion created. Inflation figures are public record. Housing prices have surged visibly, and wage growth remains stagnant. Yet, most fail to see how these facts connect. Many don't realize that the Fed's massive money printing is the reason they can no longer afford a home. They overlook the fact that inflation acts as a hidden tax, transferring wealth from everyday earners to asset holders. Instead, they dismiss these signs as mere bad luck or an unfair economy, failing to recognize that it's an engineered system. In plain sight, the Federal Reserve designed a wealth transfer, favoring the rich, using technical language that obscures what's truly happening. If you understand nothing else, grasp this. Inflation is not some natural occurrence like weather. It's a deliberate policy choice. The Fed decided to pump $4.5 trillion into the economy, deliberately inflating asset values and enriching the few at the expense of the many. They've prioritized protecting the system's wealthiest participants, and they will repeat this process during the next crisis because that's how the system is built. Your labor becomes devalued, your savings are gradually stolen, and your future is sold to the highest bidder. This isn't capitalism or free markets. It's a rigged game, where those controlling the money supply use their power to benefit themselves and their friends, pushing everyone else into poverty. The Fed's theft of 30% of your wealth isn't through taxes, but through inflation. If you don't understand how this process unfolds, you cannot defend yourself against what's coming next. Another crisis, another round of money printing, and yet more wealth being transferred upward. Without preparation, you risk being robbed once again.